Hi, everyone. So for this discussion board post, I really want to talk about how in modern America we start seeing a fluctuation between unrest and relief and government intervention, and how the population uh, is affected and responds to those things. And so the first article that I really used from this week's readings was by Turchin and Korotayev, and they talked about the structural demographic theory, and this really resonated with me because it not only helped me understand my area of interest better, it also helped me understand the current economic climate we are experiencing. And so in this theory, they relate the spikes and increases of unrest, if you will, to see the economic changes and how economics have led to these different spikes, or how the economics have changed or caused these spikes. Excuse me. So they mentioned that in 1960 there is a spike, and then in 2010 there is a spike. But it's interesting that they make the connection between violent riots, though they were fairly dominant in the 1960s. Peaceful demonstrations were 5 times more frequent than violent riots after 2010. And so their original intention of it being more violent focused, it's just riots in general, or speaking out in general, that ends up being connected to some sort of economic downturn or spike. And so that was fairly interesting as well. Now, the reason I found this resonating is I love to study the Great Depression and the church's involvement during that, and how they were able to reach out or not reach out, and why they didn't reach out or why they did reach out. And so I find it so fascinating. And so I saw this from the perspective of society reacting to money. And so this is probably more biblically based, but really, if you think about the 1920s, for example, society experienced an increase in consumerism and social change, as well as an amendment that prohibited the sale, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol. And so people are going to try to buck those systems. And from these three examples, people showed how they were going to use their money, whether spending more on wants than needs, and engaging in this shift in culture. And so we really see that during the 21st century, really. And so in my interview that I ended up doing, though it wasn't the initial one that I wanted to do, I ended up interviewing my pastor and his wife about their ministry that is focused on outreach. My church is a church plant that started back in the early 2000s, so it's a fairly new body, but they've been doing, their whole goal is to be the hands and feet of Christ whenever they present the gospel to the community, and they're very mission focused and outreach focused. And so this community ministry was able to experience the recession of 2008 and the 2019 pandemic. And so Pastor Brian was able to talk about, Brian Hammond, excuse me, Pastor Brian Hammond was able to talk about how in the 2008 recession, the church itself experienced a 45% decrease in benevolent giving. And this would be relatable to during the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, there was a 30% decrease as a relation to crowd out from the New Deal um, agencies. And so, not that they're exactly the same, but we're going to start seeing this connection and this relationship throughout history from that government intervention that we experienced in the 1930s. And so, my pastor experienced that again, 45% decrease. And so when he was going into the 2019 pandemic and we had to shut down and they had to reevaluate their budget, they initially budgeted for the next 6 months at the start of the quarantine in March of 2019. Sorry, excuse me, March of 2020. He budgeted as if they were going to lose again 45% of their benevolent giving. Now it ended up not being so. They only went down to about 30%. But again, they had to reevaluate their budget, they had to cut costs and everything like that. Now, in the other side of that spectrum, Tandy Hammond, his wife, is in charge of that community ministries that I mentioned earlier. And she experienced the 2008 and 2019 experience in two different ways. So, from a nonprofit perspective, from her perspective, they don't usually feel, as she said, a economic shift until about 6 months to a year afterwards. And so from for 2008, her ministry was fairly new, and she was able to pretty much give the same. They didn't feel it as much because they were more needs based, and also people were willing to give canned goods that they were able to distribute to these children. And so they were very small, very focused at that point in time. Fast forward to 2019, their ministry has grown significantly, and they're starting to reach out to families and women, and all is all more encompassing. But in 2019, they decided to wait as the government stepped in. And so, again, a very interesting connection between the Great Depression and this 2019 situation, where Tandy decided to step back, develop more relationships with those people having those needs. And then, when the government was going to step away and not provide that resource or money or whatever it was being provided for that family, then the church, the community ministry could step in fairly seamlessly because they had been developing that relationship. They knew they were not in need and they didn't want to overgive. And so that was very interesting. And so seeing the economics from those two perspectives were very fascinating. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say, and happy week 8.